We believed that nothing could be so expensive to us as to allow the front to stagnate. Our general conclusion was that we could not afford to sit still doing nothing, merely because we believed that at some time before the enemy acknowledged final defeat, he would attempt a major counteroffensive.
The Allies' conquest of the area in the north bordering the Ruhr River was complicated by the enemy's control of the dams along that stream. This problem, which was to recur as the Allies pressed farther into Germany, prompted Allied engineers to experiment in advance with scale models to determine just what land area would be flooded if the enemy were to open the dams. By releasing the floodwaters, the enemy would have trapped Allied forces had they tried to cross the Ruhr early in December. In mid-November, elements of the U.S. 6th Army Group drove rapidly toward Strasbourg, a French city situated on the banks of the Rhine. On the 23rd of November, the French 2nd Armored Division reached Strasbourg, but the city was not completely won until 4 days later after a bitter Nazi defense. With Germany in view just across the Rhine, the Allied forces in Strasbourg redoubled their attack against the Nazis on the opposite shore in the little German town of Kehl. Meanwhile, the 44th and 79th American Divisions made swift progress toward Haguenau to the north against stubborn resistance. The enemy was not quitting France without a fight. The Nazis surrendered at Haguenau on December 12th.
To allow any Germans to remain west of the river in the upper Rhine plain would be certain to cause us later embarrassment.
All along the Allied front, the men began to show the effects of the months of battle strain.
As the infantry replacement problem became acute, we resorted to every kind of expedient to keep units up to strength. All these measures, however, failed to keep filled the ranks of the infantry formations.
As winter approached, the Allied commanders were faced with added problems.
The infantry, which in all kinds of warfare habitually absorbs the bulk of the losses, was now taking practically all of them. These were by no means due to enemy action alone. In other respects, too, the infantry suffered an abnormal percentage of casualties. Because of exposure, the cases of frostbite, trench foot, and respiratory diseases were far more numerous among infantry soldiers than others.
To keep those casualties to a minimum, every precaution possible was taken against the spread of these afflictions.
Maintenance of morale was a problem of first importance. We established divisional centers in the rear of the lines where a company or a battalion could occasionally get out of the fighting zone and the men could secure baths, warm beds, and a day or two of rest. The effect of prolonged combat is always bad. If a unit is brought out of line before the processes of physical and mental fatigue have gone too far, it can be ready for re-entry into battle far sooner than one that has been kept in line too long. Moreover, periodic rests for the frontline soldier have a splendid effect upon morale, and in any kind of warfare, troop morale is always a decisive factor. During World War I, The American Army had received recreation and entertainment assistance from a variety of civilian organizations. We depended upon the USO and the Red Cross. The services of these devoted people to soldiers in the field were beyond praise. We also established a furlough plan, which gave at least some men the opportunity to go back to Paris.
To help make the GI's stay in the city as enjoyable as possible, the Red Cross opened several Allied clubs, which proved a haven for soldiers confused by a strange language. But the foreign flavor of Paris had a universal appeal to visiting GIs and those lucky enough to be stationed there. To a combat soldier, a trip to the French capital seemed like a visit to another world. A 10-day pass in Paris worked wonders in terms of the GI's morale, an especially important factor at this critical time. By mid-December 1944, the Allies had penetrated the German border in the Aachen sector and were threatening to push the entire battle line into Germany. Hitler realized some months earlier that only by a large-scale counterattack could Germany regain the initiative and stave off final defeat a little longer. During the early autumn, the Führer called in his top military advisors, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, Chief of Staff of the Supreme Command, equivalent to the Minister of War, and Colonel General Alfred Jodl, Chief of the Armed Forces Operations Staff. They analyzed the situation on all fronts to the most minute degree to determine the best place to attack the Allies in the West with the limited resources available. To carry out the heavy attack, Hitler mustered all the divisions he could spare on other fronts and speeded induction of young German youths. To strengthen the morale of Nazi troops, there were more frequent decoration ceremonies. No attack was too difficult to a young German soldier who had just received an award for valor from a high-ranking Nazi commander. As autumn waned, the forces which were to make the attack were secretly massed. The Nazi command had finally decided on the Ardennes region as the area to attack. Preparations were rushed so the assault could be started before the end of the year. The Nazis hoped to isolate important Allied supply routes, like the Albert Canal, which linked Liège, just behind the Allied front, with Antwerp and the sea. If the enemy seized Liège, key maintenance and communication center feeding the Allied 12th Army Group, the Allied force on that front would be seriously crippled. Allied supply centers all the way to the coast were the principal objectives of the Nazi commanders. They hoped thus to make the whole Allied supply position virtually untenable and at the same time split the Allied forces in two. With supply centers cut off, Allied hopes for an early victory would be considerably dimmed. The German attack started after preparations had been completed in the greatest secrecy on December 16th. It was a blow of staggering proportions. The Nazis employed 3 armies for the assault, totaling some 14 infantry and 10 panzer divisions.
The morning of December 17th, it became clear that the German attack was in great strength. The enemy was employing considerable armor and was progressing rapidly to the westward. In 2 important points, the enemy had gained definite surprise. The first of these was in timing. We had believed that he could not be ready for a major assault as early as he was. The other point in which he surprised us was the strength of the attack. On the morning of December 17th, 2 gaps were torn through our line. When the U.S. 7th Armored Division came down from the northern flank on December 17th, the situation was still far from clear. It pushed forward to support the left of the 8th Corps and became semi-isolated in Saint-Vite. Saint-Vite was an important point on the road net of that area and necessary to the enemy. Finally, the continued and heavy pressure of the Germans tended further to isolate the 7th Armored. A concentrated attack by several divisions on December 20th drove it to the west in the area north of Saint-Vite. Consequently, it was ordered to withdraw the next day to join the Allied lines, which were now building up on the north flank of the German salient. But the great stand of the division had badly upset the enemy's timetable. Thereafter, with 3 proved and battle-tested units, the 1st, 2nd, and 9th Divisions holding the position, the safety of our northern shoulder was practically a certainty.
The withdrawal was covered by tanks only, since the thickening weather excluded any possibility of air support. The Allies' principal problem was to keep the bulge from widening on the flanks. However far the Nazis' central thrust carried them, they must be prevented from expanding to the north and south. Beginning late in December, the Allies launched a counteroffensive, with the U.S. Third Army attacking from the south and later the First Army from the north. On the northern flank, all Allied ground forces were placed under the operational command of Field Marshal Montgomery. This group included the major part of the U.S. First Army and the U.S. Ninth Army, commanded by Lieutenant General William Simpson.
I radioed Montgomery saying, "Our weakest spot is in direction of Namur. The general plan is to plug the holes in the north and launch coordinated attack from the south."
Across the bulge, General Bradley was suitably located to command the forces on the southern flank of the salient, consisting mainly of the U.S. Third Army.
It was Bradley's responsibility to outline the exact unit sectors together with other local details of direction and cooperation. I issued verbal orders for Patton's attack under Bradley to begin no later than December 23rd. It was arranged for Patton to concentrate his attacking corps of 3 divisions in the general vicinity of Arlon.
The German attack made rapid progress through the center of the salient. During the first weeks of the Battle of the Bulge, the Germans took several thousand American prisoners and promptly took advantage of the opportunity to stock up on the highly prized American cigarettes. After years of smoking inferior Nazi cigarettes, the German soldiers were grateful for the change. Though under constant Nazi attack, Bastogne was successfully defended by the 101st Airborne Division, led by Generals Anthony McAuliffe and Maxwell Taylor, who returned to the command of his division during the Bastogne siege.
The defense of Bastogne was not only a spectacular feat of arms, but had a great effect upon the outcome of the battle. Bastogne lay in the general path of the sector of advance of the German 5th Panzer Army. On December 19th, the 101st prepared to defend Bastogne. That morning, we did not know whether Bastogne was yet surrounded, but the strength and direction of advance of German troops in that area indicated that it quickly would be. Consequently, the 101st Division prepared for all-round defense, and although the assaulting armored divisions of the Germans bypassed it to participate in the attack to the northwest, the division was under constant pressure from other German units from that moment onward until relieved. One of the breaks in our favor occurred on December 23rd. This was a sudden, temporary clearing of the weather in the forward areas, which released our air forces to plunge into the battle. The important road center of Bastogne could not have been held by the 101st Division during the German counteroffensive in December 1944, except for the airplanes that delivered 800,000 pounds of supplies to the division during the critical days between the 23rd and 27th of December.
By early January, the real danger to the Allied position had passed, and the exhausting process of pushing the enemy back to his former line began. Patton's Third Army had cut a corridor through the German-held territory to beleaguered Bastogne. Additional reserves were brought up to strengthen the new Allied offensive, which hammered the retreating Nazis continuously. The ground for which the enemy had fought so bitterly and paid such a heavy price was once again in the hands of the Allied armies.
German Air Force had come out in the strongest attack it had attempted against us in months. Reaction of our own planes was swift. The enemy lost almost half his entire attacking force. Two days later, the First Army began its attacks on the northern flank, and all danger from the great German thrust had disappeared. From that moment on, it was merely a question of whether we could make sufficient progress through his defenses and through the snowbanks of the Ardennes to capture or destroy significant portions of his forces. From both flanks, we continued attacks in the direction of Upaliz, where we joined up on January 16th.
With the meeting of the U.S. 3rd and 1st Armies at Upaliz, north of Bastogne, the gap was closed and the Battle of the Bulge was ended. Both armies turned eastward and continued the drive to push the Nazis back into the heart of their country. But the going was slow on the icy terrain. The motorized vehicles, which could function in almost every type of country, had never had quite the problem they faced as the Allies plodded eastward in miserable fighting weather.
The First and Third Armies continued eastward to drive the Germans beyond their initial lines. The losses on both sides in the Battle of the Ardennes were considerable. Our own were high. Altogether, we calculated our losses at a total of 77,000 men, of whom about 8,000 were killed, 48,000 wounded, and 21,000 captured or missing. The enemy suffered serious casualties in tanks, assault guns, planes, and motor transport. These we estimated at 600 tanks and assault guns, 1,600 planes, and 6,000 other vehicles. Field commanders estimated that in the month ending January 16th, the enemy suffered 120,000 serious casualties. In view of the fact that after the war, German commanders admitted a loss of about 90,000, this estimate of our own would seem to be fairly accurate. I wanted to pass to the general offensive as quickly as possible, because I was convinced that in the Battle of the Bulge, the enemy had committed all of his remaining reserves. I counted on a greatly weakened resistance because of the widespread discouragement that I felt sure would overtake the German armies. I visited General Simpson's 9th Army and found it keyed up and well prepared for the attack.
The Allies' immediate objective was the clearing out of all Nazi troops west of the Rhine. This difficult assignment was to fall to 3 army groups: the 21st in the north, the 6th Army Group in the south, and in the center, the 12th Army Group, composed of the U.S. 1st Army and General Patton's 3rd Army, under the overall command of General Bradley. On the Eastern European front, the Russians began a drive of massive dimensions along the entire battle line on January 12, 1945. The offensive was spearheaded by 4 Russian army groups. Commanding one was Marshal Georgy Zhukov, who was already becoming a hero of epic proportions to the Russian people. The Russian generals counted heavily on the success of one crushing blow. The Russian offensive staggered the Nazis. In 60 days, the drive by some 300 infantry divisions and 25 tank corps was to push the enemy back across Poland, East Prussia, and across Germany to the Oder River, a distance of roughly 300 miles. In the west, the major Allied drive was also getting started.
As soon as the U.S. First and Third Armies had joined forces at Uffalese on January 16th, Montgomery returned to specific preparation for the advance. Montgomery and I agreed on the proper timing for his initial attack. Originally, we had wanted to make a simultaneous assault by the Canadians and Americans, both of whom could be ready by February 10th. However, neither Montgomery nor I felt it wise to wait. He proposed, and I approved, that the Canadian attack should begin as quickly as possible, even if a period of 2 weeks or more had to intervene before the American Army could join in the operation. The Canadian Army jumped off February 8th. It made satisfactory initial gains, but the troops quickly found themselves involved in a quagmire of flooded and muddy ground. Progress was slow.
According to the plan, the keynote of the operation was to be speed. But the weather conditions could hardly have been more unfavorable for a rapid advance. Allied hopes for a quick breakthrough were killed, and the fighting developed into a bitter slugging match in which the enemy had to be pushed back yard by yard. When the Canadians launched their attack, the enemy was slow to respond. But the attackers' difficulty in moving fast over the waterlogged terrain gave the Nazis a chance to consolidate their defenses. Soon, every offensive move by the Canadians was met by stiff resistance. Every square mile of territory was fought for savagely.
General Marshall suggested that I send my chief of staff to Malta to participate in a conference that was to take place there between the President, the Prime Minister, and their respective staffs before they went on to Yalta.
The combined chiefs of staff endorsed General Eisenhower's plan, questioned by the British command, for cleaning out the area west of the Rhine by a series of crushing blows.
I well knew that with General Marshall backing me, there would be no danger of interference.
Playing a key part in the Allied offensive to the banks of the Rhine were British and American fighter pilots who worked in close support of the Allied ground forces. Veterans of many sorties against the enemy, they were thoroughly accomplished in dealing with Nazi targets.
Groups of fighters could now be located at forward fields near the Rhine, and in spite of their comparatively short range, could operate over almost any Nazi target. As the effects of the air offensive accumulated, there developed a continuous crisis in German transportation and in all phases of her war effort. The effect was felt also by the Luftwaffe. It had a definite influence upon the ground battles. By this time also, the air had achieved remarkable success in depleting the German oil reserves. By early 1945, the effects of our air offensive against the German economy were becoming catastrophic.
After the Canadians launched their drive in the north, General Simpson's U.S. 9th Army and elements of the 1st Army joined the attack.
Preceded by a violent bombardment, the 9th got off as scheduled.
The GIs could do little but wait until the floodwaters of the Ruhr River receded sufficiently for a crossing to be attempted. The opening of the Ruhr River dams by the Nazis had flooded the Ruhr Valley and caused the level of the river itself to rise about 4 feet. For 2 weeks, the floodwaters poured down the Ruhr Valley and held up the advance of the U.S. Ninth Army. But by February 23rd, the flood had subsided somewhat, and the Ninth Army's drive was launched in earnest.
Initially, the troops encountered great difficulties, particularly because of hostile artillery fire upon their floating bridges.
Once across the Ruhr, the advancing GIs had to fight their way through the German city of Jülich. Jülich had been heavily bombed and shelled by the Allies before Ninth Army troops entered the city, which they captured on February 24th, the day after they had crossed the Ruhr. The rubble resulting from the Allied air and artillery bombardment slowed the passage of Allied vehicles and equipment through the city en route to the front.
In spite of delays, Simpson's forces made fine progress. In less than a week, the Ninth Army captured Mönchengladbach. I entered the city with General Simpson shortly after its capture. This was the largest German city we had captured in the war up to this time. The whole area was rapidly cleared of the enemy. Everything went like clockwork. The 7th Corps on Simpson's right first overcame heavy opposition, then continued a spectacular advance, and on March 5th was on the outskirts of Cologne. We had calculated that this city would be stubbornly defended. But by the afternoon of the 7th of March, General Collins had taken over the city. The hastily trained and astonished defending troops were by no means the equal of those we had met earlier in the campaign.
Cologne was completely won in less than 2 days' time. The celebrated cathedral was one of the few buildings still standing after the heavy Allied bombings.
While Collins' 7th Corps was making these great advances, Hodges launched the 3rd and 5th Corps southeastward toward the Rhine. The 3rd Corps reached the river at Remagen on March 7th. Here it encountered one of those bright opportunities of war, which produce incalculable effect on future operations. The assaulting Americans found the Ludendorff Bridge over the Rhine still standing at Remagen. When Bradley reported that we had a permanent bridge across the Rhine, I could scarcely believe my ears. I fairly shouted into the telephone, "How much have you got in that vicinity that you can throw across the river?" That was one of my happy moments of the war. The traditional defensive barrier to the heart of Germany was pierced.
American engineers quickly repaired the damage inflicted on the Ludendorff Bridge by the Germans.
At the same time, we established floating treadway bridges, which were easy to transport, quickly installed, and capable of sustaining heavy military loads.
The first treadway bridge across the Rhine, a 330-yard span, was completed in 10 hours and 11 minutes, and the first load was on its way across the river. Other treadways were constructed, and after 5 days, the Ludendorff structure was no longer needed. The Remagen bridgehead across the Rhine was quickly consolidated.
The German effort against the Ludendorff Bridge finally began to weaken it seriously. And on March 17th, the center span fell into the river. It carried with it a number of our fine engineers, some of whom we were unable to rescue from the icy waters.
North of Remagen, Montgomery prepared for a forced crossing.
The Rhine was a formidable military obstacle, particularly so in its northern stretches. Study of conditions indicated the great desirability of naval participation in the attack. We needed vessels of sufficient size to transport tanks with the leading assault waves, and so the Navy began the transfer to the front of landing boats. These small ships, some of them 45 feet in length and 14 feet wide, were successfully transported overland for participation in the attack. The assault on the night of March 23rd was preceded by a violent bombardment. Our preparations for the crossing had been so deliberately and thoroughly made that the enemy knew what was coming. We anticipated strong resistance, since we would achieve surprise only by the timing and strength of the assault. On the front of the two American divisions making the attack, the 30th and 79th, 2,000 guns of all types participated.
To assist the troops of Montgomery's 21st Army Group, who were to make the assault, a heavy smoke screen was laid down over the area where the crossing was to be made. This assault across the Rhine constituted the major Allied effort in the North in this phase of the battle for Germany. To General Eisenhower, the crossing of the Rhine was one of the most important steps in the hastening of the Nazis' final defeat.
We received a series of encouraging reports. Everywhere, the landings appeared completely successful. The two American divisions making the assault on the 9th Army front suffered a total of only 31 casualties during the actual crossing. We were encouraged to believe that we could very quickly achieve such an eastward advance that the communications leading into the Ruhr would be cut.
The airborne units were scheduled to make their drop on the far side of the Rhine at 10 o'clock on the morning following the assault in small boats. The airborne troops were transported to the assault area in a total of 1,572 planes and 1,326 gliders. The planes were heavily loaded for the trip. The takeoff was a breathtaking operation.
In this operation, the two airborne divisions were to drop close to the front lines, merely far enough back so that they would not be within the zone of our own artillery fire. From those positions, they were to wreck the enemy's artillery organization and participate directly in the tactical battle.
The airborne units arrived over the area of Wesel on schedule, and the paratroopers readied themselves for the jump. Preparations were also made for cutting the tow lines and setting the gliders adrift. On the whole, the landings went off smoothly. Only a few Allied planes were shut down.
Operation Varsity, the name given to the airborne phase of this attack, was the most successful airborne operation we carried out during the war.
Meanwhile, the ground forces of Montgomery's 21st Army Group crossed the Rhine in increasing numbers. The preparatory artillery fire and bombing had proved most effective, and a firm foothold was established on the east bank of the river. The town of Wesel was rapidly cleared. The enemy's resistance had been confused and disorganized, and the defending force was quickly overwhelmed.
During the morning following the crossing, I met the Prime Minister. Mr. Churchill always seemed to find it possible to be near the scene of action when any particularly important operation was to be launched. He rarely failed to inject into most conferences some element of emotion. On that morning, he was delighted, as indeed were all of us. He exclaimed over and over, "My dear General, the German is whipped. We've got him. He is all through." The Prime Minister was merely voicing what all of us felt and were telling each other. After I left the area, the Prime Minister persuaded the local commander to take him across the Rhine in an LCM. He undoubtedly derived an intense satisfaction from putting his foot on the eastern bank of Germany's traditional barrier. However, had I been present, he would never have been permitted to cross the Rhine that day. Possibly, he felt the act was symbolic of the final defeat of an enemy who had forced Britons back to the wall 5 years before. Antwerp is an inland port connected with the sea by the great Scheldt estuary. The German defenses covering these approaches were still intact, and before we could make use of the port, we had the job of clearing out those defenses. Capture of the approaches to Antwerp was a difficult operation. The Scheldt estuary was heavily mined, and the German forces on Walcheren Island and South Beveland Island completely dominated the water routes leading to the city.
The battle for Walcheren Island raged on for 8 days.
The amphibious assault against Walcheren was carried out against some of the strongest local resistance we met at any coastline during the European operation. Final German resistance on the island was eliminated by November 9th. Following this spectacular and gratifying operation, Antwerp quickly became the northern bulwark of our entire logistical system.
The first Allied ships arrived in Antwerp, ready to unload on November 26th. The supply problem in the Allied northern area was considerably brighter. The results of the seizure of Antwerp were felt along the entire front.
The Germans began launching the frequently erratic V-2s against the city in mid-October.
Even more frightening, though less devastating, were the older V-1 rocket bombs. The Nazis were fully aware of the importance to the Allies of the key port city and continued their crippling rocket bomb attacks throughout the winter.
Numbers of civilians and soldiers were killed, and communications and supply work were often interrupted, although usually only for brief periods. The civilian population of Antwerp sustained these attacks unflinchingly.
The V-1s were often intercepted and exploded before they had a chance to land. Their shrill scream acted as a warning signal for Allied forward spotters outside Antwerp.
Defensive measures against the V-1 soon attained a very high degree of efficiency. But even so, the threat of their arrival was always present at all hours of the day and night and in all kinds of weather.
Radar was used to great advantage. The harbor at Antwerp was the chief objective of the Nazis' rocket bomb assaults. Damage to the harbor facilities was considerable. But Europe's greatest port was soon operating at capacity levels in support of British and American armies at Germany's frontier. The Allies planned to strengthen their forces at the front in preparation for the final great campaign to force the Nazis into unconditional surrender. Supplies arriving at Allied ports were unloaded and speeded on their way with not the slightest delay. All the men who contributed to the swift movement of these essential supplies to the battle line worked around the clock. The Allies were rolling in high gear on the road to Berlin. The battle of supply, though not yet won, was fast turning into another outstanding Allied victory.
The vital importance of air power became apparent soon after the war's beginning. In those first years, the major defensive struggle was directed against the Nazi air attack. As the aerial threat to the British Isles continued, the attention of the world was centered on the skies over England. In 1940 and 1941, the Royal Air Force battled savagely against heavy odds to ward off the Nazis' pulverizing air attacks on England. In the epic Battle for Britain, everyone in England turned to and worked ceaselessly in the struggle against the powerful Nazi air offensive. Month after month, England gallantly fought for her life. The Luftwaffe hammered England without let-up, but the RAF fought back with every plane at its command. England's unparalleled effort in the battle for Britain was all that prevented the Nazis from winning a quick, overwhelming victory in World War II. After the United States became actively allied with Great Britain, the English scene took on a new complexion. In preparation for the arrival of sizable American Air Force units, construction was rushed on airfields, housing facilities, and hangars. In the early months of 1942, it became apparent that the U.S. would have to transform part of England into a giant base for its planned air offensive against the Nazis. By mid-1942, the facilities were ready for the building up of the U.S. Air Force in England. British officials viewed the growing strength of the American air arm with mounting enthusiasm, well aware of the powerful weapon that would soon implement the Allied attack. Beginning on July 1st, 1942, American aircraft for the new U.S. 8th Air Force began arriving in England. During that first month, more than 400 planes were turned over to the 8th Air Force. But the flow of planes to England did not continue at the expected rate during the rest of the summer and autumn. Shipments to England were reduced considerably, since a certain amount of new planes had to be sent to fighting fronts in other parts of the globe. But by the end of 1942, the U.S. Air Arm in Europe, which from humble beginnings was to grow in the next 2.5 years to a force of more than 13,000 planes, was gradually assuming the proportions necessary for the all-out air war on the Nazis. Harassing the Nazis from the south were the U.S. Air Force units in the Mediterranean.
The importance of Mediterranean bases for furthering our bombing campaign against central Germany was always a factor in the development of plans. On August 1st, 1943, a special bombing effort was carried out from an African base against the Ploesti oil fields, the most important single source of natural oil available to the Axis. The attack was conducted at treetop height, and every crew was briefed to bomb a particular facility in the great installation.
dangerous mission was carried out with great gallantry, but American losses were heavy. 1/3 of the planes and their crews did not return.
As usual, mathematical calculations could not win over unexpected conditions, but the effort was reasonably successful.
The effectiveness of the raid was later estimated at 42.5% of production wiped out. One of the two major functions of the Allied air forces in the European theater was its use as a tactical weapon.
The air can be employed in a variety of ways to forward the progress of the land battle. One of these was to attack the enemy's supply lines. Destruction of bridges, culverts, railways, roads, and canals by the air tends to isolate the force under attack. In several crises of the European campaign, the air flew more than 10,000 combat sorties per day as its share of the ground air battle.
The other major function of the Allied air forces was its strategic use.
We were most anxious to effect the destruction of German industry. The effect upon the land battle would be most profound, and the eventual winning of the war would be correspondingly hastened.
Fall downswing, yes, you may taxi out and take off, over.
The British strategic bombing operations were usually begun at dusk.
Their experience had driven them to bomb only at night. Otherwise, they suffered unsupportable losses. We believed that this was due to the fact that British bombers were designed for range and weightlifting at the expense of speed and defensive firepower.
As a rule, British bombers flew without fighter support. Beginning soon after its victory in the Battle of Britain, the RAF launched its all-out offensive against the heart of the enemy's homeland. These attacks grew in intensity. But as the war progressed, the Germans' defense against the British night raids grew more effective.
Achtung!